Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Gopi Jana Vallabha Siddhradhari. Gopi Jana Vallabha Siddhradhari. Yasoda Nandana Braja Jana Ranjana. Yasoda Nandana Braja Jana Ranjana. Yamuna Tira Vanachari. Yamuna Tira Vanachari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Gopi Jana Vallabha Giridvaradari. Gopi Jana Vallabha Giridvaradari. Yasoda Nandana Braja Jana Ranjana. Yasoda Nandana Braja Jana Ranjana. Yamuna Tira Vanachari. Yamuna Tira Vanachari. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prastaya Bhutale Srimanti Bhakti Vedanta Swami Niti Namine. Namaste Saraswati Devam Gauravani Pracharine Nivarshesha Sunyavadi Paskyata Deshatarine. Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasari Gaur Bhakta Vindam. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Jaya Radha, Parthasarthi Radha, Parthasarthi Radha, hey. Jaya Nitya Gaura Chandra, Jaya Nitya Gaura Chandra, Jaya Nitya Gaura Chandra, Jaya Nitya Gaura Chandra. Jaya Sita Ram, Jaya Sita Ram, Jaya Sita Ram, Jaya Sita Ram. Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada. Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada. Jaya Om Vishnu Paramahansa Paravrajacharya Asto Satatara Sada Shri Srimad. His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Founder Acharya ISKCON, His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Jai Om Vishnu Paramahansa Paravrajacharya Asto Satatara Sada Shri Srimad. His Divine Grace Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami Thakur Ki Jai. Jai Vishnu Pada Srila Gorakasura Das Babaji Maharaj Ki Jai. Jai Vishnu Pada Srila Satchidananda Bhaktivinoda Thakur Ki Jai. Jai Vishnu Pada Vishnav Sarvabhauma Srila Jagannath Das Babaji Maharaj Ki Jai. Jai Srila Rupa Sanatan Bhatta Raghunath Sri Jiva Goswami Bhatta Dasa Raghunath Sat Goswami Prabhupada Ki Jai. Namacharya Srila Haridas Thakur Ki Jai. Prem Sikaho Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shiva Sadi Gaur Bhakta Brinda Ki Jai. Shri Shri Radha Krishna Go Gopinath Shamakund Radhakund Gitter Govardhana Ki Jai. Vrindavan Dham Ki Jai. Mayapur Navadvip Dham Ki Jai. Gangamayi Ki Jai. Yamunami Ki Jai. Bhakti Devi Ki Jai. Tulsi Devi Ki Jai. Nantakota Vaishnava Brinda Ki Jai. Samaveda Bhakta Brinda Ki. Gaur Premanandi Hari Hari Bo. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. Hare Krishna. Jai Namo Vishnu Jai Krishna Stagwa today. Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swami Namane. Namaste. Om Jnanatimrandasya Gananjana Salakaya Chakshun Naditanyena Tajmai Shri Guruve Namaha Shri Chaitanya Mano Bhishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutade Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yukta Parakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sahagachatam Sahagana Lagaratam Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Ladita Shri Vishaka Vitam Scha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopikanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tata Kanchana Gaurange Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishastani Sutadevi Pranamai Hari Priye Vanchakalpa Tirubhyascha Kripa Sindhu Bhyevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasari Gaur Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Okay. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So this morning we're reading from the 4th Canto, chapter 28, text 52. This chapter is called Puranjana Becomes a Woman in the Next Life. And we'll go through the Sanskrit together. Brahmana Uvacha Ka Tvam Kasyasi Ko Vayam Sanyano Yasya Sochasi Gyanyasi Kim Sankayam Mam Ye Nagre Vicha Chata Ha Brahmana Uvacha Katam Kasyasiko Vaityam Sanyano Yasya Sochati Jnanasi Kim Sankyam Mam Yanegre Vichachartraha Brahmana Uvacha Katvam Kasyasiko Vakyam Sanyano Yasya Sosati Jnanasi Kim Sakyayam Mam Yanegre Vichachartaha Brahmana Uvacha Katvam Kasyasiko Vakyam Sanyano Yasya Sosati Janasi Kim Sakyayam Mam Yanagre Vichatartatha. Anybody would like to? Tingataya Mam Enagre Vichachartaha Ladies? Okay. So the translation is, I'll read it and then we can all read it together in a minute. The Brahmana inquired as follows. What? Wait. Who are you? Whose wife or daughter are you? Who is the man lying here? It appears you are lamenting for the dead body. Don't you recognize me? I am your eternal friend. You may remember that many times in the past you have consulted me. So now we can do it together. The Brahmana inquired as follows. Who are you? Whose wife or daughter are you? Who is the man laying here? It appears you are lamenting for this dead body. Don't you recognize me? I am your eternal friend. You may remember that many times in the past you have consulted me. Purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. When a person's relative dies, renunciation is automatically visible. Consultation with the Supersoul seated within everyone's heart is possible only when one is completely free from the contamination of material attachment. One who is sincere and pure gets an opportunity to consult with the Supreme Personality of Godhead in His Paramatma feature situated within everyone's heart. The Paramatma is always the Chaita Guru, the spiritual master within, and he comes before one externally as the instructor and initiating spiritual master. The Lord can reside within the heart, and he can also come out before a person and give him instructions. Thus, the spiritual master is not different from the Supersoul situated within the heart. An uncontaminated soul or living entity can get a chance to meet the Paramatma face to face, just as one gets a chance to consult with him, with the Paramatma within his heart. One can also get a chance to see him actually situated before him. Then one can take instructions from the Supersoul directly. This is the duty of the pure devotee, to see the bona fide spiritual master and consult with the Supersoul within the heart. When the Brahmana asked the woman who the man laying on the floor was, she answered that he was her spiritual master, that she was perplexed about what to do in his absence. At such a time, the Supersoul immediately appeared, provided the devotee is purified in heart by following the directions of the spiritual master. A sincere devotee who follows the instructions of the spiritual master certainly gets direct instructions from the heart, from the Supersoul. Thus, a sincere devotee is always helped directly or indirectly by the spiritual master and the Supersoul. This is confirmed in Chaitanya Charitamrita, Guru Krishna Prasade by Bhakti Lata Bij. If the devotee serves his spiritual master sincerely, Krishna automatically becomes pleased. Yasya Prasada Bhagavat Prasada. By satisfying the spiritual master, one automatically satisfies Krishna. Thus, the devotee becomes enriched by both the spiritual master and Krishna. The Supersoul is eternally the friend of the living entity and always remains with him. The Supersoul has always been ready to help the living entity, even before the creation of the material world. It is therefore stated here, Yanagre Vichacharta. The word agre means before the creation. Thus the Supersoul has been accompanying the living entity since before the creation. Brahmana uvacha katvam kasyasiko vayam sanyano yasya soshasi janasi kim sakayam mam yagne gre vichachartaha. The Brahmin inquired as follows. Who are you? Whose wife or daughter are you? Who is the man laying here? It appears you are lamenting for this dead body. Don't you recognize me? I am your eternal friend. You may remember that many times in the past you have consulted me. So first of all, I'd like to thank all the devotees of the Delhi temple here for such a warm and kind reception. I just got here yesterday and I'm overwhelmed with all the attention, but thank you very much. It's very nice. So in this particular verse, there's a very important concept that's being shared, and it's the concept that Supersoul is within our heart. And we know the Supersoul has been in our heart ever since the very beginning. It says right here, the Supersoul has been accompanied living entity since before the creation. So the question then becomes, how well are we listening to that Supersoul? How much are we paying attention to it? And it's being explained that in this particular case, King Paranjana took the life of this beautiful lady who was the daughter of the king. And now that her husband has passed away, she's lamenting. He's laying there, and she's a little confused. She was worshiping her husband nicely, following nicely, and then now he's gone, and that relationship is taken on a different dimension. And we're being advised in the purport that she still has the opportunity to listen to Supersoul. But there's some conditions provided here that in order to hear Supersoul correctly, she must be following in a nice way. So the challenge that I have is sometimes we see that people are believing that they're following Supersoul, when in fact, maybe they're not. A very good example of this historically, although many of you are very young, many years ago there was a president in the United States, his name was Ronald Reagan, and a very kind of crazy man by the name of John Hinckley felt that Supersoul was giving him the instruction to go shoot the president. And he actually tried to do this. He came out with a gun, and bam, 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 bam. He didn't succeed, but he did kill some other of his bodyguards. And when he was interviewed, he was telling the people, they try to figure out why people do these sort of things. And he said, God told me to do it. And he was very sincere. He wasn't, he was a little unbalanced maybe, but he really believed that God had told him to do this. And in fact, actually, this is not so uncommon. It's very sad. Not too long ago, there was another case in America where one lady, she killed her own children. When she was asked why, she said, I had an apparition from God. He told me to kill my children. So these people think that they're also following Supersoul. And probably one of the most dramatic examples, I think most of us are familiar with it. Not too long ago, some people who were convinced that God told them to fly these planes into the buildings in New York and take down 3,000 people died. Does everybody know about this? People remember this? It's still some young people here, I don't know. These people from another tradition felt that it was their religious duty, that God was telling them, we have to fly these planes and destroy these buildings. So the question becomes, how do we know if we're hearing God within the heart properly? Because I think most relatively rational, sane people can understand that God's not going to tell you to fly a plane and destroy buildings in another country and kill, I think it was up to 3,000 innocent people just going to work, just doing their job, just trying to raise their family. And all of a sudden one day, for 3,000 people, that completely changed. And in fact, I grew up in New York, so I know people that were there. That had a traumatic effect on people all through southern New York, all through that whole area. Everybody knew somebody that was affected. So I think we can conclude that probably wasn't something that Krishna wanted these people to do. So there's many examples like this. I don't want to take too much time giving so many examples, but the question that I'm asking is, how can we know? Because even within our own Krishna conscious movement, we're finding some people are believing Prabhupada wanted us to do this, and some people are saying, no, he wanted us to do that. And there's some different controversies and divisions in what people think Srila Prabhupada wanted. And everybody believes that Srila Prabhupada is talking to them. No, Prabhupada told me I should do this. And the other person is saying, Prabhupada told me I should do this. And they're two different things. And sometimes there may be some real, conflict. Could get very vocal, maybe even more than vocal. So how do we know? How do we know that Super Soul, how can we check on the quality of what we understand Super Soul is asking us to do? Krishna says, Sarvasyaham Hridi Shanishvato Matasmatir Ganam Apoanam Cha, that I'm situated within everyone's heart. And he gives knowledge, remembrance, and forgetfulness. So maybe we knew and then we forgot. There's so many things that can be happening. So that's the question. That's the challenge that I have. Does anybody want to suggest how can we actually know? Can anybody give some suggestion? How do we actually know that we're actually maybe getting some good instruction and not some crazy idea that our mind is generating? What are the checks and balances? Can anybody make some suggestion? Guru Sadhu Sastra, very good. That's actually a very powerful one. Does somebody else have a different answer? Same thing? Yeah, that's another flavor of Guru Shastra Sadhu. Yeah. So I believe what you're saying, this is a concept of you judge a tree by its fruit. So if you're doing something and you're getting a positive response and it looks like it's working in a good, favorable way, then maybe that's a confirmation that this is a good thing to do. Did you want to say? Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, so he's saying he knows his heart is not pure, so he's not so sure whether Super Soul can guide. But that's the problem, is generally speaking, people who are convinced that they're doing God's work are not even considering that maybe their heart isn't pure. That's actually a very advanced stage of consciousness, that I am not so pure. And in fact, actually, when we surrender to the spiritual master, that really should be our state of consciousness. You throw yourself down full dandavats and you say, oh, my dear spiritual master, I am a fool, number one. I can't do anything properly, so please give me instruction, advice, guidance, direction. And then we follow. That's actually first-class mentality. But sometimes we get a little bit proud, maybe. We think, oh, I've done this, I've done that. And then all of a sudden now we're thinking we know everything and we can do everything. Okay? So this is actually a crisis in the world today. Now, of course, within our Krishna consciousness movement, at least we have some concept and some idea that maybe because of our imperfect senses and propensity to cheat, propensity to make mistakes, and the propensity to fall into illusion, that maybe we have to be very careful before we actually carry out some behavior, some specific behavior. But if you're not within the guidance of the Vedic literatures through a spiritual master, which unfortunately the overwhelming majority of the rest of the world is, then it becomes really, really crazy. The concept of actually being humble, particularly in the business world, is seen as a weakness, and you'll be taken advantage of. So we're a little different in that sense. But unfortunately, that's really what the bigger world is dealing with. There's actually a very good section in the beginning of the Bhagavad Gita. Arjuna asks a question which gives even further details on how we can understand what is the way we can see and look and experience whether or not maybe we're not hearing Super Soul correctly. Because Maya is very tricky. She gives us this idea that somehow, I know this, I know that, I know this. So Arjuna specifically asks this question: what are the symptoms of one whose consciousness is thus merged in transcendence? This is right in the beginning, chapter 2 of Bhagavad Gita, right? He's asking this question. How does he speak? And what is his language? How does he sit? And how does he walk? This is chapter 2, text 54, for those who want to check it. Very, very astute questions. Right away, I want to know. Because there's so many people who are saying, I know what's going on. Listen to me. I like to sometimes tease a little bit that in America, probably here in India to a certain extent, but in America it's very popular. They have these pubs, these bars where people go, they drink a little bit. And every one of these drinking places, there's always somebody there. And he's a little bit inebriated. And he'll tell you, let me tell you what's going on. And he is going to tell the world what he thinks is going on. And that's kind of a dramatic illustration. And there's somebody in every place. You find somebody, right? We go places, and I don't know, maybe not so much here, but I know where I come from in California, everywhere you go, somebody has an opinion on what's going on. Right? Politics, economy, equal rights. They make departments, they make all these organizations. Everybody's trying to figure out how to solve all the problems in the world. Of course, they're not so interested in what Krishna has to say about that. They all think that they have a better idea. There's actually a logo in America for the Ford Motor Company. Ford has a better idea. Okay? Because that's the way people think in the West. If you're taught to think independently. I know when I was raised, it's even actually said, think for yourself. Don't let anybody else tell you what to do. They actually pride themselves in this. That's why the West are creating all these things that sometimes are helpful and maybe not so helpful. Every new thing they create has some advantage, but it also has the backside, which is the disadvantage. We're very proud about what all our new things can make, but we don't like talking about all the difficulties that they cause. The car is a wonderful vehicle, but then you have all this problem with pollution and junkyards and metal everywhere, and they have to pave over all the streets. So, you can say there's advantages, but there's also disadvantages. So the Western world is not so inclined to want to take instruction. It's not their nature. It's not our nature. That's why we're in the material world. The very first thing that happens when you choose to turn away from Krishna, the very first thing that manifests is the false ego. Immediately, Krishna says, oh, you want to do on your own? Okay, I'll give you some false ego, some mind and intelligence. These are material concepts we learned from Bhagavad Gita. I'll give you the false ego so you can think you're so smart, and I'll give you the mind to go do what you want and the intelligence to figure out how to do it. And then we go, oh, wow, great. Now I can really have fun. Right? And then we just go down and down, and we get totally entangled, which is being explained in this verse here. The Pranjana got so entangled. Of course, it's an allegory, a story, but it represents how we can become so completely encumbered with our, particularly the family. I mean, the family can be very helpful, but it can also become a complete encumbrance, which is what we're hearing. He became so enamored and so involved and so mentally absorbed and worried about his wife, his family, his children, that when he took his last breath, that's what he was thinking, and now he's being born as a beautiful daughter of this king. Because yam yam vapi smaran bhavam tyaja tyanti kalevaram, that whatever state of being one remembers when he leaves the body, that state he shall attain without fail. Without fail. Be careful what you are thinking. Which is why we're always trying to stay fully absorbed in some way of remembering the spiritual master in the lotus feet of the Supreme Lord. So anyhow, so Arjuna is asking these questions. How do I know? Who should I be listening to? Certainly not the man down at the local pub who's going to tell you how to solve all the world problems. We shouldn't be listening to him. But sometimes people look very knowledgeable. They have big degrees with all sorts of letters at the end. They've been studying this science, that science, whatever. They sound like they got a nice suit and tie, and they're sitting behind a podium, and there's other professors all sitting there, and they're saying, I figured out that the world needs this, that, and the other thing. So sometimes it's not so easy. So Arjuna is asking this question. What are the symptoms of a person who actually knows? What are those symptoms? And here they are. He gives up the desire for sense gratification, which is all coming from our mind, right? That's one of the symptoms. Whoa, right there, you've knocked out a whole lot of these so-called experts. Most of the world is intoxicated and chasing after sense gratification. They don't like to admit it, and they certainly don't want you to tell it to them. But we can observe, right? And they find satisfaction in the self alone. That's called Atmaram. We find that a truly mature transcendentalist, he can be satisfied just sitting and thinking of Krishna, chanting his japa. He doesn't need all of these fantastic things. He doesn't, the cinema and so many other things are there. He doesn't need, he's satisfied, right? He's not disturbed even amidst the threefold miseries. What are those miseries? Adi-atmic, adi-daivik, adi-bautic miseries. Most people, sometimes if one of these things happen, miseries from the demigods, we know, and the United States has been getting some very serious karma. These hurricanes are coming, these tornadoes are coming in California where I live. Huge fires are burning. The biggest fire that's been in California since they've been recording this information occurred about 2 weeks before I left on this trip. Something like 60,000 acres. It's almost hard to comprehend. Burned. And so many people are going, oh my gosh, my house might burn. And many houses did burn. Right? That's adi-daivik misery. Are they Atmaram? No, they're very disturbed. But to speak of adi-daivik, adi-bautic, I'm a little bit ill right now. It's a little difficult because I want to share, I want to speak, but can't blow the conch shell. But try to transcend like that. And then, of course, other living entities. How many times is somebody doing something to us and all of a sudden we're very disturbed? We can be sitting there having a very nice day. Somebody comes in and says one sentence and immediately our mind is completely disturbed. Right? We can actually measure within ourselves how advanced we are. Arjuna is asking such brilliant questions, and Krishna is giving very detailed information that we can use as a measuring stick or a milestone. How transcendent are we? When something happens, do we just completely get upset and start running around making phone calls and typing emails and all sorts of things? Or sometimes in the service of Krishna, we might have to do something that's transcendental. That's a little different. So these are the symptoms of somebody who's actually advanced. He's not elated either when there's some happiness. I know when I was being trained in Krishna consciousness frequently, when something good happens, it's a common expression. I don't know if it's still popular, but something good happens and the devotees go, oh, it's Krishna's mercy, Prabhu. Rahu, right? You get an extra sweet ball or something, right? We all have our own measuring stick. But then what happens if something doesn't happen so well? You don't get any sweet ball. Is that also Krishna's mercy? Yes, it is. We don't generally think of it that way. Of course, I'm giving us somewhat of a silly example, but sometimes it's more serious than that. When something good happens, it's like, wow, we're all happy running around. And then when something bad happens, we're like, oh, we don't want to talk to anybody. But a person of transcendence, he's like, okay, sometimes good, sometimes not so good. Still, I come to the temple, I do my service, I pray to the deity, my spiritual master, and I carry on. These are the symptoms of a person who's actually transcending, right? He's freed from attachment, fear, and anger. It's right there in Bhagavatam. I'm just paraphrasing what Arjuna is being told by Krishna. He's free from attachment, fear, and anger. How many people can say they're free from attachment, fear, and anger? You try to take my computer and I'll say, no, I'm attached to that computer. I'm actually attached to the knowledge on the computer. But free from attachment, fear, and anger. That's a person who's a sage of steady mind. Unaffected by good or evil. I mean, these are kind of repetitory. He's being answered in several different ways. In case you don't get it the first way, maybe you'll get it the second way. Neither praising or despising. That person is in fixed consciousness. Steadiness. It's like a straight line. Our lives, maybe I should speak for myself, my life, something good happens, oh, good. Something bad happens, oh, no. Something good happens, oh, yeah. Something bad happens, oh, no. So it's like it's a sine wave for those of you who are familiar with science, right? It's going up and down, up and down. But a sage of steady mind, it's like a straight line. Okay, this is happening, that's happening, this is happening. Okay, still the consciousness is straight line, fixed, right? So again, it gets back to all of these things require some austerity. And when we talk about austerity, generally it means to keep your senses under control. I have a personal way when I'm meeting new people, and I've been told that I'm pretty good at assessing people out. One of the things I look at is how well are they controlling their senses? And you can, basically what I've learned, and there's scriptural support for this, is you can only trust a person to the degree at which they can control their senses. If their senses are out of control, then at any moment, who knows what they'll do. And this is, I like to use extreme examples because it becomes very obvious with extreme examples. But for example, people who get addicted to drugs, their senses are completely out of control. So much out of control that when they need more drugs, what they'll do is they'll go rob. Some of the biggest crime in America is done by people who are addicted to drugs because they're so controlled in that sense by their senses. This is an extreme example. That they'll just go to the next house and they'll steal the TV and then they'll go sell the TV and get money and get the drugs. So it's an extreme example, but we have a tendency to do like that also. When I was working for the Department of Defense, every morning people would come to work and they had to have their coffee. And you try to ask them anything before they have their coffee and I can't think until I have my coffee. So who's in charge? The coffee. They're controlled by their senses. Sometimes it's subtle also. The person who can come to work, no coffee, no problem, that person is more control over the senses. So this is the general guidelines of how we can tell whether or not we're getting clear instructions from the Supersoul. And I know I've also observing that sometimes we forget. And in conclusion, I'd also like to point out in terms of these qualities that we should be looking at, don't forget the first verse of the Nectar of Instruction. Right? A sober person who can tolerate the urges of the tongue, the mind's demands, the actions of anger, and the tongue, the belly, and the genitals can make disciples all over the world. It's a simple sentence, but it's really packed with some very powerful instructions. Now the guru business has become big business. I'm sure you have it here in India. I know where I come from in Southern California. It's actually a disgrace. There's people coming from India, they put a turban on and they put up a sign. All sorts of people are coming. They say a few Sanskrit words. They tell a bunch of nonsense to get people to feel good, even though they're doing all sorts of nonsense. And then they're asking for donations, and people go, oh, he's from India, he has a turban, and he speaks some Sanskrit, he must be a guru. And yet when you turn around, you find they're not controlling the senses. They're not actually even teaching, for the most part, they're not teaching even what's in the scriptures. They may paraphrase a little bit. So this is what we're very fortunate because Srila Prabhupada has given such a perfect standard. And I point this out to people. I live in a town where people are following all sorts of things, and I always say to them, do you notice that when Srila Prabhupada speaks, almost every second or third sentence, he's quoting something. He's quoting Bhagavad Gita, he's quoting Srimad Bhagavatam, he's quoting Chaitanya Charitamrita. We take that for granted, but if you ever have the misfortune of listening to some of these other people, you'll find most of the time they're not quoting anything, or they may be quoting some popular new writer, or, Einstein. Everybody likes to quote Einstein and Shakespeare. But we don't do that so much, okay? So I'd like to also point out that in these qualifications for how we can really know we're talking the Supersoul, I want to point out what it doesn't say. Because I think sometimes we get a little bit enamored, partially because the Western world teaches us what? The person who has their picture in the newspaper the most, oh, he must know what's going on. The whole Hollywood movie industry is like that, right? They have this thing called the paparazzi. They're trying to run around and get photographs of all these movie stars to get their pictures. Whether you have your picture in the newspaper or not has nothing to do with whether or not you are an advanced transcendentalist. Yet some people make that mistake. And similarly, whether you have thousands of disciples, or you've written thousands of books, or you have a charismatic nature, or you're attractive, or you're popular, or you're political, or you're clever, you're witty, you're intelligent, or you're educated, none of that has anything to do, you don't see that in any of the things that Krishna is telling Arjuna. These things can be used in Krishna's service, but you could be a big, big PhD with so many qualifications and acknowledged by so many institutions, but if you haven't been trained in Krishna consciousness, then what is the use of all that? These things are not the signs of an advanced soul. Krishna gives clearly, we just went over so many signs of an advanced soul. The two foundational points that I think we should all try to remember is a simple answer. Those who can control their senses, right? And those who are able to practice a little bit of austerity. They're kind of the same thing when you think about it. Usually the more austere a person is means the more they're not as inflected. Although don't forget, there's also austerities in the mode of ignorance, so we want to be careful of that also. So there's so many guidelines. So either you have these qualities, some austerity, and you've got your senses under control, or you don't. It's that simple. All the other stuff comes second. If you have those qualities, and you're intelligent, and you have some good character, you're diplomatic and so on, then you can become a very, very powerful devotee. Prabhupada was like that. Prabhupada had some science, he understood as a pharmacist some things, but that wasn't what made him the great man that he is. It was his bhakti. And he was put in so many situations, sometimes very austere situations. When he first came to New York, it's hard, I think, for some of you who've never been to some of these northern countries, how incredibly cold it can get, even below zero. If you want to get some sense of what it's like, go down to the restaurant and walk into the walk-in freezer and spend a couple hours in there and see what it's like. It's cold. Try to imagine the whole world, there's ice on the ground. And Prabhupada came in 1965. He's living in Vrindavan, India, where it can get 100 degrees out. And he wasn't prepared for it. And all of a sudden now, in that particular year, because I lived in New York, I was actually there for it. 1965 and 66, that winter was one of the worst winters. Sometimes when I was a boy, I'd come out of the house. You couldn't even open the front door. It was covered with snow. 6 feet of snow. Snow is ice. Snow is powdered water is what it is. And Prabhupada's coming. So you read his diary, he's talking about, he's having this little game with his own mind, going down to the dock, thinking maybe I should go home. But he didn't do that. Because Super Soul said, no, you keep pushing on. So even in that sense, we can see devotees very determined. So, what time is the class supposed to end? 9 o'clock? Yeah, okay. So we're just a little bit before 9 o'clock. I don't know. I can keep talking, but maybe we should ask if there's any questions or comments somebody would like to ask.
Thank you for a class which made me introspect a lot. A lot of very, very legitimate points which can make us think. And I just had two questions. One, of course, we would like you to share with us your experiences when Srila Prabhupada was on the planet, was on this planet. Mm-hmm. And the second question is, it's about, you said that it is not possible to trust someone who's not austere or who does not have control of his senses. But it is also mentioned that Vaishnava's behavior cannot be really comprehended. Vikidana Bhujai. Mm-hmm. So sometimes often when people who are senior to us, if they behave in a manner which seems externally not so much in control of their senses, how does one deal with this issue? And the decisions that they make us take under that behavior pattern when they seem angry.
Right. Well, just in clarification, I think what I said was, to the degree a person cannot control their senses, to that degree you should be a little careful, okay? And I'm referring now not necessarily to people that are senior to us, but I do think we have seen so many people, and there's some verse in the Gita that goes, one may restrain the senses and the organs of action, but whose mind dwells on the sense objects certainly deludes himself. And he is called a pretender. So we don't always know what's going on in the heart of people. Sometimes there's been pretenders who've come. They look like they're doing so many nice things, but then if they're not actually purifying the heart, then they fall away. So, but yeah, there is a certain etiquette. It's not our business to be judging. But I do think it's sometimes important to notice, once in a while sometimes, and certainly we're not talking about the Babajis and these exalted personalities who are living on a completely different level of transcendence. They're there, but for the most part, not so much. I don't observe in my life so much. So that there's a different way of thinking about that. But as a general rule, if you're seeing repetitively, I think it's the repetition is where the problem comes in. Once in a while, somebody might do something a little strange, from our opinion. They say if you see your spiritual master walk into a pub, you have no doubt that they're doing it for some probably good reason. And that's true. They probably are. We don't want to make the assumption they're going into the pub to purchase a drink, right? That's a bad assumption. No, they're going in probably to sell a book. In fact, we actually did that when I was on the Radha Damodar traveling party in 1970, whatever it was, 6, I think it was. It was a strange form of Sankirtan. We literally go into these drinking halls and just take over and put the books out. And these people were like, they were throwing their money around anyways. Here, throw it over here. We'll give you a couple books. And then we'd run out before they knew what happened. They're so miserable in so many ways. That was an exciting event, right? Otherwise, they're just sitting there getting inebriated and talking about all the problems they're having with their family, their boss, their car, their dog, whatever it is. That's all that's going on there. And you come in and all of a sudden you're showing these transcendental books. It's like a whole big new event. So anyhow, the point is that we don't want to draw the wrong assumptions. But if you see repeatedly behavior which is somewhat questionable, you might want to back up a little bit and take a new look. Because usually what I've observed is that repeated behavior, if it's not corrected, the real question is who's in charge, you or your senses? If your senses are dictating, you can usually observe that. Somebody's controlled by their senses, so you can usually observe that. And if somebody is rock solid, it's like, no. You can observe that too. And I'm saying this is my personal measuring stick when I'm dealing with people. And as far as my personal dealings with Srila Prabhupada, I came very late. I did not really have a whole lot of personal dealings. I was, by the time I came, Prabhupada was always surrounded by like his first line of generals, you might say. I had a few little exchanges. They were all very sweet, but of course, obviously, one thing I can say is Prabhupada was always an extraordinary individual. The one experience I did have, which I just recently recorded down in Bombay, they have the Prabhupada Memory Series. I think maybe people don't know about that. I'll just briefly share this story because you asked. My parents, I was raised as a young boy that I knew that I was going to go to college when I went to grade school. That was just the standard. Well, but by the time I got to my senior year in college, I decided I didn't want to finish because I wanted to become a disciple of Srila Prabhupada. So I dropped out of college in my senior year. You can imagine how upset my mother was. Very upset. And yet, anyhow, I had the opportunity, it's a long story, I'll make it very short, to have my parents meet with Srila Prabhupada and another devotee's parents. And they met him in New York at the 55th Street Temple, which was a 13-story building. Prabhupada was so proud. It was right smack in the middle of Manhattan, right a few blocks from Times Square, which is one of the biggest intersections in the world. So we had an opportunity. My parents came to see Srila Prabhupada, and I was there. I had decided before I went into the room, this was one of the rare occasions where I actually had an opportunity. I could have asked Prabhupada, he was sitting right in front of me. But my understanding was that the disciple, like I said earlier today, is just down on the ground. I am a fool, just give me instructions. Sometimes people would try to ask cute questions and get Prabhupada's attention. Sometimes they were good, but sometimes I think they're a little pretentious. So I had decided, whatever happens, unless I'm asked, my job was to listen, and listen very carefully. It's a good mood. We should do more listening and less talking. And so I didn't really say so much, but what was very interesting is Prabhupada charmed my parents. He completely charmed them. Remember, my mother was very upset. I dropped out of college the year I was going to graduate. And so that was prominently what she was asking him about. Well, my son dropped out of college to become your disciple, and now what is he going to do? Because she didn't understand anything other than that paradigm, right? And he told her, he said, your son is doing the most powerful welfare work in the entire world. And she, it took a little more than that. But he charmed her so much that my mother was also a freelance writer, and she'd write little haiku poetry and submit it to the newspaper and magazines and stuff, and they would print these things. Nothing of any real substance ever came of it. But I found out 2 years later she wrote a major, major story. And she submitted it to the New York Times, and they took it. And they syndicated it across the entire United States. This story, it was called My Son Jumped on Krishna's Chariot or something like that. Or My Son Became a Hare Krishna. I can't remember exactly what it was. And if you read this article, you can see she was completely charmed. Prabhupada completely charmed her. You can see it. It's just the way she wrote the article. This man was an 80-year-old man, and he came to America, and he was able to completely establish this religion, reestablish the Sankirtan movement. And here's the interesting thing about this. When it was published, it wasn't only published in New York, it was the New York Times syndicated it. Chicago, Los Angeles, California, Texas, Dallas, Kansas City, wherever they had local branches. New York Times has branches all over the United States. And it was printed in all those newspapers. So that morning when it came out, my mother told me, the phone was ringing, 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 ringing. Every time she'd put it down, ringing, ringing, put it down, ringing. And people were calling from all over the United States. And there's all sorts of interesting stories in here, too, because at that time, there was we had just won a major victory in New York with Adikeshava, where the high court judge, there were many people who were disturbed in the early days in the Christian consciousness movement. I don't know how much, you're all young people, I don't know how much you realize that they thought the devotees were completely out of their mind in America. to put on what Westerners see as a bed sheet and to stand on the corner and bang on a tambourine. They thought you had to be completely crazy person. And shave your head, too. Remember, back in those days, there were hippies with long hair. Even that was shocking. But to shave it all off was even more shocking. Okay? So many people were very upset and did not understand the Christian consciousness movement. And it was so bad. There was so much resistance that a lot of the parents from children, and also keep in mind the other religious organizations, particularly the Jewish people, because many of the younger devotees, many of the first devotees that came to Srila Prabhupada were from the Jewish tradition, and there's all sorts of reasons for that. It's actually a compliment to the Jewish tradition, but they didn't see it that way. They saw it as, wait a minute, you're draining all of our young people. And the Christian faith, which is afraid of everything other than Christianity, right? They just, oh my good, this is the work of the devil. So they joined together, they actually created some legal resistance, and they tried to sue Srila Prabhupada and the Hare Krishna movement to stop it. And they were slamming it, calling it a cult. So a big court case came up in New York. And Prabhupada, as usual, just handled it brilliantly. And he told Adi Kirish, you go into the courtroom, full shaved head, tilak, saffron, and you take all these books and you put them down on the judge's table and you say, this is our religion. It's older than the entire Catholic Church. We have more scriptures than one little Bible. We've been around since the day of Lord Brahma. And actually, Paramatma within the heart of the judge, he's looking, he's going, oh my goodness. Who knew? These strange people with bed sheets and tambourines actually have a whole volume of information about the transcendence of the soul. And he made a judgment. This Hare Krishna movement is a bona fide religion. And Prabhupada was, big smile. He was so proud. It was actually the turning point. It was a turning point for our movement, because up until then, people were just, they're nutty people, they're crazy people. They didn't take us seriously. And when they finally realized that we were basically undermining the entire concept of the whole Western tradition of consumerism, then they go, oh, wait a minute, we got to do something. So they did this legal thing. So in the middle of all this, very shortly, right after it, of course, most of the common average person wasn't aware of this legal case, but it came just right after it happened just before my mother wrote this article. So I asked her, I said, well, Mom, the phone was ringing, 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 ringing. People are calling, and what were they saying? So I asked her, I said, out of 3 categories, favorable, neutral, or unfavorable? And she said the overwhelming majority of the people that called were favorable. Some were neutral. There were some neutrals. And I said, but how many people were, And she said, only 2. And usually, actually, that's pretty extraordinary when you think about it. Again, because of the whole purpose of the discussion we had today, the Western world, everybody thinks their opinion is so important. And so for people who were threatened or disturbed by our movement, they wanted to share their opinions with who? The mother of a devotee. Do you realize your son is blah, 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 blah? And she said, well, actually, no, he's not like that. And no, actually, Srila Prabhupada isn't like that either. He had charmed her. So anyhow, that's the one story I think is really worth sharing. It's also, I'm sure they're going to put it on the memories tapes. There's other little stories, but for the sake of time, I'll end there. Jai Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai.
His Grace Mayeshwar Prabhu Ki Jai.